Start. Welcome to Masechet Makkot. We're going to be starting to learn Makkot Daf Bet. Masechet Makkot is sponsored by Terry Kravosha and Rabbi Chaim Herring in loving memory of Terry's father, Judge Norman Kravosha, Nachum Meir ben David Ber V'Malka, on his fourth year at site, and in honor of Dr. Judith Hauptman. Our dad instilled in us a lifelong learning, and in honor of Dr. Judith Hoffman, their first Talmud teacher and one of the pioneers who opened the door to Talmud study for women. Okay. I hope that you listened to Dr. Ayala Hoffman-Lipson's introduction and read Gita Neufeld's introduction to the Masechet, because both those things will be very helpful to give you perspective on this actually very short Masechet, which is nice. It's one of the shortest Masechet. Maybe it's even the shortest. No, it's not the shortest. Horayot is the shortest. We'll get there. We'll get there not so pretty soon, actually, in September. But it's a very short Masechet. It's the first Masechet that I finished when I was 18. So it's one of my favorites. And it's a very interesting Masechet that basically covers three topics. Okay, and one of the things that Ayala said in her introduction, which is very nice, is that they're all mentioned in the first Mishnah. Okay, it's almost like this first Mishnah gets to all the major things, which is number one, eidim zomemim. That's what we're going to start with, conspiring witnesses, which we're going to talk a lot about today. The second is when you go to an ir miklat, which, by the way, I'll mention. Maybe it's good, especially if you're new to Hadran, but even if you're not new to Hadran, you might not know all the things that we have to offer. But one of the things is weekly shiurim that go in depth into the daf. So since in a daf shiur, you don't really have time to go in depth so much. The weekly shiurim offered by called Beyond the Daf. You can also subscribe by podcast to the Beyond the Daf content or find it on our website. But the other thing is we also have courses from time to time. And there's a digital course on our website specifically on the second chapter of our Masechet about ir miklat, with 4 shiurim that I taught that are guided toward building skills in Gemara, something we also don't have time to do in the Daf Yomi class. And really, number one, building skills. Number two, delving in depth. So I recommend, if you have time, maybe after Pesach, you probably don't have time during Pesach, although maybe some people do, but to perhaps learn the course alongside doing this, and it'll really enhance your learning, both how to learn and also understanding how to get really in depth into what we're learning in the Gemara. Okay, so the third topic is the third chapter, which is Elu Hen Elokim, who gets lashes. And we also talked about the fact, we've talked about this before, we mentioned at the Siyum, this Masechet is really a continuation of Masechet Sanhedrin, and at some point, the academics believed that this was one long Masechet, and then it was just split into two, not split as evenly as the Bavas were, where 10 chapters, 10 chapters, 10 chapters, but this is sort of like an addendum to Masechet Sanhedrin. And you can really see that because the second chapter and the third chapter, Elu Hen Golin and Elu Hen Elokim, which sounds very much like Elu Hen Niskalin, Elu Hen Nisrafim, right? All the list of the people who get those punishments. So it's very much a continuation, which is important to see because particularly our Mishnah is going to really be a continuation of the last Mishnah in Sanhedrin. And when I say last Mishnah, I don't mean in the 11th chapter that we learned in Perek Chelek, because if you remember, the Gemara switched the order. Right, the 11th part was really stuck at the end because of all the different topics, and you could see it was a totally different style of Gemara, and they put it at the end in the Bavli. But in the Mishnah, it's actually Perek. That's the 10th Perek, and Elu Hen Nechnekim is the last Perek, and after that, it ends with the very end of that leads in, and we're going to get to that right away in the Gemara. Okay. But the real question, and I mentioned this at the Siyum yesterday, which is our Mishnah starts off in a very strange place. If the topic of chapter 1, which really it is conspiring witnesses, eidim zomemim, which maybe we should give some background to what are conspiring witnesses. There's different ways witnesses could be convicted of lying. But there's only one way where they're actually going to get punished, because often you have a case where 2 witnesses say something and 2 witnesses say something else, and you don't know who's telling the truth. So, and we learned about this before in this famous Machloket Abai and Rava, eidim zomemim is he lemafren nifsal or mikanu lahaba. Eidim zomemim, according to some, is like a big chidush. It's not even so clear that we believe the second group and knock out the first group and punish them. It's just that that's what the Torah determined that we do. Okay? Some people think, no, it's obvious that this is just makes sense and this is truth. So there's 2 kind of ways of understanding it, and that affects whether when they're disqualified as witnesses for lying, are they disqualified from here on in? And that's if you go with the option, it's a chidush. It's something unique that the Torah just said. If it happens in this way, we're going to believe them and punish the first. Or if it's really, this is how we determine truth, then it would be also retroactively everything they testified about should be canceled. That's a side issue. What I want to get at is what exactly is eidim zomemim? So eidim zomemim is when two witnesses come forward and testify, and then two other witnesses come and say, there's no way you could have said that because we were with you, the witnesses, at that time somewhere else. Now, just like those two witnesses, and this is why some people say it's not a chidush at all, it's just obvious, just like two witnesses could come in and say, those witnesses stole, and if they stole, we learned in Sanhedrin, they can't be witnesses, and disqualify them, they can also disqualify them in this way. If they're talking directly to the witnesses and not, oh, what you said about the person who killed is not true because we were with the murderer somewhere else at that same time, that's different. That's just contradictory testimony, and then we don't know what to do. We throw everyone out of court. But we don't punish anyone because we don't know who's telling the truth. It's like those classic riddles. Somebody says that who's telling the truth, who's lying, right? One is telling the truth, one is lying, and how do you figure it out? Very hard to determine. But if it's done in this way, that two people say and basically testify about the witnesses themselves, that they couldn't have testified, we believe them, and then let's get the terminology right. The witnesses who lied are now called eidim zomemim, and they're convicted. Their punishment is kasher zamam laso lachiv. What they wanted to do to their fellow, to the defendant, what they tried to do to that person, they get punished. The others are called the mizimim. They turn other people into eidim zomemim. They're called the mizimim. Okay, those are important terminology to get. Now, there's a few other rules that we're going to learn along the way, and I'll maybe mention some of them so that we're going to get, because some of them are even going to be in today's daf, which is there's something strange about this whole idea. Think of the words kasher zamam laso lachiv. Kasher zamam laso lachiv is the punishment they get, what they tried to do to someone else. So the rabbis learn, and they have a big argument with the Tzdukim about this, the Sadducees, but we'll get to that later. But they say there's a law called harago einan neheragim. If they killed, let's say, two witnesses come, they lie about someone that murdered. Based on their false testimony, they convict the murderer and kill the murderer. And after that, the eidim mizimim come and say, oh, you couldn't have testified, you were with us. They actually don't get the punishment. They only get the punishment when they tried to kill someone else. It's actually counterintuitive. They killed someone, it should be worse, right? They should, of course, be killed. But no, it's only what they tried to do to someone else. If they actually succeeded and the person already was convicted and the punishment was given, they do not get the punishment. Okay, that's a very unique halacha here that, again, is a little counterintuitive. It's maybe why the Tzdukim disagreed about it. But it's all because of something they tried to do and didn't actually succeed in doing because they were convicted first of being eidim zomemim, conspiring witnesses, and therefore they get the punishment. Okay, we'll stop here with all our introductions and we'll start learning. So the Mishna starts off with a great question, which is where you would have thought if our topic, again, assuming we know our topic is eidim zomemim for this chapter, it starts off ketzad eidim nasim zomemim. How do witnesses become zomemim? And what would you expect? What I just told you. Right? And that would be the first thing you would teach in the eidim zomemim class. You would say, if two witnesses come and say the following, and then two witnesses come and say, no, you were with us on that day, and that's what you would expect. Now that comes up on Daf Dalid, okay, which is also Mishnah Dalid. It's the fourth Mishnah in the chapter, and the Mishnah describes exactly what I just told you. But instead of getting an answer to the question, the answer to that question only comes later. Okay, so they kind of put the central question up, but they don't answer it. And then they answer a totally different question. They say, "Mi'idim anu b'ish ploni shu ben grusha ben chalutza." If the witnesses testify about a person that he is a kohen and he's the son of a kohen who married a woman he wasn't allowed to marry, whether a divorcee, a woman who underwent a chalitza ceremony, which is the husband died, they didn't have children, she's supposed to marry the brother, and the brother doesn't want to marry her, so they do the chalitza ceremony with the shoe. We won't get into all the details right now. But according to Torah law, if a kohen marries a divorcee, then it makes his son or daughter a halal or a halala. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means the son can't work in the temple. The son can't do anything basically kohen related. The son's children are halalim. It continues to go down throughout the generations. If it's a daughter, she can't marry a kohen. Kohen can't marry a halala. Okay, same for the chalutza. Okay, if he marries a chalutza, now that's only by rabbinic law, not by Torah law. It doesn't say chalutza in the Torah as one of the kohen can't marry. But since a chalutza is similar to a divorcee, the law is the same. So now they testified that the father of this person had married a divorcee, which would turn that person into a chala. And yes, you can't eat truma. Yeah, all the things related to kohanim apply. Thank you for reminding me about that one. Ein omrim yaseh zeh ben grusha ben chalutza tachtav. I mean, I think so anyway about the truma. I'm pretty sure. I don't remember now, but don't quote me on it. Ein omrim yaseh zeh ben grusha ben chalutza tachtav ela loker arba'im. So now they say, what would be the kasher zamam? We would turn the eidim zomemim into a halal. Okay, what's the problem? Well, there's a few problems. The first major problem, which interestingly enough, the Gemara doesn't quote, but maybe it's just that kind of stands behind the whole thing, is that for most people, it's irrelevant to be called a halal. If you're a Yisrael, you're not a kohen, which most people, the majority of the population, were not kohenim, it's an irrelevant, okay? If I'm a Yisrael who's called a halal, so what does it mean? I can't work in the temple. I couldn't work in the temple anyway, right? Anything. It's true for a kohen, it's going to be true for me, okay? But by the way, they can't do Birkat Kohanim either. They can't do the blessing of the Kohanim. Now, so that's the number one reason. This is just not relevant. And the other thing is, it's a status. A ben grusha, ben chalutza, halal is a status. You can't change the status of someone. Kasher zamam is you tried to do an action, you tried to do something. This person would get some sort of punishment. Not exactly a punishment, okay? So you can look at it from all different ways. But basically, the Mishna says you get lashes. Okay, when you can't get the regular punishment, you get lashes. And likewise in the next one. If you say about someone that he's supposed to go to the ir miklat because they killed accidentally, okay, so if you kill accidentally, we'll get all into the details. You run to this refuge city and you're protected in the refuge city. This refuge city has two different elements to it, really, or three, I would say. And we're going to talk about this a lot more in depth when we get there. Number one is a punishment, galut, okay? And even the wording galut is a punishment. What is galut, right? We know we were exiled, right? That's called galut. So you're exiled. That's a punishment. On the other hand, there's also, you go through an atonement process there. It provides you with kapara, with atonement. And it also gives you protection from the person who's trying to kill you. The relative of the person you killed is trying to kill you. You're protected in the city. So it has all sorts of elements to it that are totally irrelevant to punishment. It's not just a punishment. It's also a place for atonement. So it's not relevant for someone who didn't kill B'Shogeg to go to an Ir Miklat. Again, it's sort of like a status thing, right? It's similar to the Ben Gusha Ben Chalutza. It's just not relevant. So Ein Omrim Yiglezet Taktav. So the person doesn't get galut. Ela lo karaba'im. So the witnesses, punishment they get is we get lashes. Okay. Now we're going to start the Gemara with the big question that I asked, which is, they ask it a little differently, but ha ketzad ein eidim noasim zomemim b'bayale? Okay, first question is, this isn't how do witnesses become zomemim. This is how do witnesses not become zomemim. Now, they are zomemim, but what is zomemim really? The word zomem, okay, let's talk about the word. Why are they called zomemim? They should be called eidim shakranim or something, liars. But they're called zomemim because because of their punishment. They get the punishment kasher zamam, as they tried to do to someone else. They're witnesses who tried to do something to someone else, and as a result, are getting punished. Now, and what's their punishment? Kasher zamam. So what they tried to do. Now, when do we have a case that's an exception to the rule where they don't become eidim zomemim? They don't become conspiring witnesses in the sense that they don't get the punishment kasher zamam. That's what we want to know. These are exceptions to the rule, not the basic case. And the question was the basic case. The question should have been, it should have said, when don't they get the punishment kasher sama? Ve'od. And the second question is, mitakatane lekaman, since it says it later on, where I told you on Daf Dalid, aval amru lahem me'achatem eidim sharei b'to hayom atem hayitem imanu b'makom ploni harei elu zomemim. That's the answer to the question in our Mishnah is actually in the Mishnah on Daf Dalid. So that also doesn't make any sense. So Gemara answers like this. Why did we start in the middle of a topic? Because really this is a continuation of Sanhedrin. And Tana Hatamkai, the Tana was standing at the end of masechet Sanhedrin in the very last Mishnah, again, which wasn't the last Mishnah we learned, but the last Mishnah, what we call the 10th parak, which in the Mishnah was the 11th, Kol hazomemim makdimim la'ota mita, chutz mizomemei ba'kohenu bo'ala. There we were talking about which people get strangulation. And what we said, one of the groups of people who get strangulation, that was the last chapter, was eidim zomemim, who lied and claim that a man had relations with a married daughter of a kohen. And there it's a bit of an exception to the rule. He gets chenek. Why? Well, there's two punishments there. There's a man and the woman, and the man gets chenek, and the woman gets burned. But in this case, you're not going to have a case where the eidim zomemim, they can't get two punishments. And theoretically, they should get the harsher one, which is streifa, burned like the woman. But because of a drasha in the pasuk, kasher zamam, okay, where it says kasher zamam, it says laso la'achiv, like you tried to do to your brother. So when there's a case where there's a man and a woman, and you testified against both of them, the same mouthful, you said they have relations with each other, then you get the punishment of the man and not of the woman, and that's why it's on the list of the nechnakim. So that's an exception to the rule. It's not exactly the same kind of exception as here, but it's an exception because instead of getting the punishment she gets, you get the punishment he gets. And then, now we're going to have a transition sentence that doesn't exist, but they're basically saying it's as if there's another transition sentence between that Mishnah and our Mishnah. Yesh zomemim achirim she'ein osim b'hem din hazama kol ikar ela makot arba'im. And then, besides that case where they're only going to get the punishment of one of them and not the punishment of both the man and the woman, or the harsher of the two, but there's some cases where you don't actually get kasher zamam at all, and you're going to get lashes instead. And that's the lead into our Mishnah. Ketzad, what would be the case of that? And then that brings you to our Mishnah. So we're basically saying we started in the middle of a topic because we really just got there through this transition. And then later we get to the basics of eidim zomemim. Okay, so it's the way, right? You might not have organized it that way if you were writing it, but you could see at least the logic. By the end of today's class, I'm going to suggest another reason. Okay, so don't worry if this is not satisfying to you. I have another reason. It actually connects to Pesach. So this will hopefully keep you going till the end of the Shiur, pique your curiosity. Now the Gemara wants to know, where do we get this from? And we're going to do this twice. We're going to do where do you get it from? That in the ben grusha ben chalutza case, you get lashes. And where do we get it from? That in the galut case, the rotzeach b'shgaga, accidental murder, you're also going to get lashes if you lied about it. You were conspiring with witnesses. So Menane Mile, and both are going to have the exact same structure. We're going to have one person who says we learn it from a pasuk, and another person who's going to say we learn it from a kal v'chomer. And in both cases, the kal v'chomer argument will be rejected, and they will reinstate the first one and say it must be that the first one is the right answer. So Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Da'amar Krav, Asitem lo kasher zamam, lo v'lo l'zaro. It says in the pasuk, you're supposed to get the punishment you tried to do. Asitem lo, you do to him, to the witness. Now, lo v'lo l'zaro, not to his children. If you turn someone into a halal, what's going to happen? His children will be halalim also. This is not a punishment that transfers to children. If a kohen marries a divorcee, it will transfer to the children, right? Because I said it keeps going down till you get to a girl. When you get to a girl, that's the end game. Her children are not halalim, but all boys that are born continues, and their children will be halalim, and their children will be halalim. So, since it says the witness is supposed to be punished himself, but not his children, so if you were to turn him into a halal, basically you would not be able to, right? It would affect his children as well. And that's not fair because this is not a punishment. Not that it's not fair, but this punishment is specifically for the witnesses. It's not something, right? There are a few punishments like halal, for example, that pass on to the children, or mamzer, for example. But most things don't. And this particularly says to him meaning him and not anyone else, not to his children. So if you turn him into halal, it would pass to his children as well. The lifsalei dide below lifsalei lazare. So they say, why don't we just do like this? We'll turn the eidim zomemim into a halal, and we'll say, but it doesn't go to his children. Okay, this is like even though normally halalim, their kids are halalim, in this case, we'll say, you become a halal, and it doesn't affect your children because vasitim lo. And that would have been a good solution, and that would reject this. And then we'd say, you would be able to turn him into a halal. To which the Gemara answers, Bi'inan kasher zamam la'asot v'leika. No, it's because it needs to be the same as what he tried to do. And since he tried to turn this person into a halal and that person's children into halalim, if we only make the witness a halal and we don't make his children halalim, then it won't actually be kasher zamam. So therefore, we're going to basically say kasher zamam doesn't work because you can't make his children. And if you don't make his children, then it's not really kasher zamam anyway. And that's why we got to lashes. Okay? That's number one. Parpada omer kavachomer. It's a kavachomer. Why? Maha mechalel eino mitchalel. Now we have to get to the fact that a kohen himself who marries a divorcee is not called a halal. Very strange thing. Only his children. This is learned out in Sotah Daf Kaf Gimel. V'lo yichalel zaro ba'amav. Shouldn't disqualify your children, it says about the kohen, meaning his children become halalim, but not him. Now, by rabbinic law, he does. Okay, so a kohen who marries a divorcee can't work in the temple, which anyway, no one's working in the temple these days, but can't work in the temple. Can't do Birkat Kohanim, okay? The kohen is disqualified, but that's only by rabbinic law. By Torah law, only the children. It's very interesting. It's a very weird thing. So now they say the following. If the one who actually did the sin of marrying a divorcee or having relations with a divorcee, having a child through the divorcee, is not himself mitchalel, so the michalel, the one who causes the problem, doesn't actually become a halal, haba lechalel velo chilel are conspiring witnesses who tried to turn someone into a halal. They were less successful than the father because the father actually did it. And the father who did it doesn't become a halal. So the one who tried to, but lo chilel, but wasn't successful because that's what happened. They were conspiring witnesses and then didn't work what they tried to do. So obviously his judgment by logic should be less severe than the father himself. So meaning he should have become a halal. And that's why he gets lashes instead. Because halal is only someone who, right? Even if someone who actually does cause someone to be a halal doesn't become a halal, then of course the one who tried shouldn't be added. But matkifla Ravida said that's a bad kal chomer. Why? In can be talta Torah eidim zomemim. You're basically negating the whole logic of eidim zomemim because remember, what's eidim zomemim built on? You tried to do something and didn't succeed, and that's when you're actually going to get punished, right? The harago ein haragin. If you actually kill the person, you won't get killed. So that's what we're going to see right now. Starting now on Amabet. Umahas sokel eno niskal. If someone who stones another, now who stones another? We're going to say conspiring witnesses who lie. I'm sorry. Witnesses, right? If let's say there's false witnesses, but they come and testify that the person deserves stoning. Let's say they worshipped Avodah Zarah. The person gets stoned. Let's say before they found out they were conspiring witnesses, they killed the person. What's the law for conspiring witnesses? I already told you, harago ein haragin. They don't get the death penalty. So if they cause someone to get skila, okay, they're not exactly a stoner. They didn't stone a person, but they caused someone to get stoned, and they're not niskal, and then we find out they were eidim zomemim, they don't get stoned. Haba liskol velo sakal eno din shelo yisakel. And if we take your kavachomer about the mechalel she'eno mitchalel, and his din is worse, then here, if someone conspiring witnesses who lied and actually got the guy convicted on their lie, they don't get stoned. Then someone who tries to, meaning conspiring witnesses who get caught before they actually kill the person, the defendant, velo sakal, right? So they tried to but didn't succeed. Enodin shelo yisakel. The same logic would say, of course they don't get stoned. And that is against eidim zomemim, because that's what I said. The weird thing, again, about eidim zomemim is if they actually succeeded in giving the person the punishment, they don't get punished. But if they didn't succeed, they do get punished. So that logic of your kavachomer and saying there's no way they could get punished, well, then no eid zomemim would ever get punished, and therefore your logic doesn't stand. Toso doesn't like this explanation of Rashi. First of all, sokel is not the person who stoned; it's a person who convicted someone based on their false testimony and got someone stoned. Tosa raises a whole bunch of problems. He says the Gemara should have just simply said harago ein haragin, right? The term that describes this thing. Tosa has a totally different explanation to this. Who's the sokel? That's a no niskal. And he says, I'm just going to read for a minute at the end of Tosfot, he quotes Rabbeinu Tam, who says, Perush Adam hasokel chavero ba'avanim. It's someone who actually stones someone, which makes more sense in terms of the wording. Tosfot says we're talking about if let's say somebody kills a person by stoning him, okay? He threw stones at a person and killed them, not having to do with the punishment skila. What's his punishment? He doesn't get stoned because he's a murderer. What does a murderer get? Saif. This is a good review of Sanhedrin for those of you who aren't new to Daf Yomi. When you learn Sanhedrin already, you get the penalty of saif, of killing by the sword, decapitation. So if the person who kills someone by stoning isn't stoned himself, then someone who tries to get someone convicted of stoning and didn't succeed, Eino din shelo yisakel. Shouldn't we assume that if I actually killed someone with stoning by stoning them, and I don't get that severe punishment, because remember, stoning is the most severe. If I tried to, like an eidim zomemim, and I didn't succeed, for sure I shouldn't get stoning. So that's a different way of reading this. Knocking out the kal vachomer. Either which way it knocks out the kal vachomer, it shows this whole thing isn't logical. You can't teach this based on logic. And therefore, we reinstate the previous one and said what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said. So, Vasitem lo kasher zamam lo velo lezaro. Okay, to him and not to his children, and that's why I can't become a challah. But again, standing behind this whole thing is really that there's no way to have a clear punishment for a ben grusha, ben chalitza, because we'd have to distinguish. If you're a kohen, maybe you could get it because it would be relevant to you. If you're not a kohen, it's not relevant to you. We're not going to create something where some people get this punishment for it and other people get a different punishment for it. It's just not relevant, and also it's a status thing. So there's all sorts of reasons, but Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi at least finds a drasha and a pasuk, which is always a nice, strong way to teach something. Now we're going to do the same thing with the second case of the ir miklat, but it's going to have to be different because the content is different. Where do we get this from? Amarish Lakish, like I said, it's going to be the same structure, pasuk and kal vachomer, and then reject the kal vachomer, and then reinstate the first one, or not reinstate, but say that one is a much stronger one. Hu yanus Amarkra, the pasuk says, Hu yanus alachat harim. Who goes to the ir miklat? It says in the pasuk, he will go to the ir miklat, right, to one of the cities. Now, it could have just said, right, Yanus will run, but it says he will run. He comes to tell you who velo zomemim. Only a person who murders bishkaga, and not who else. Who else would you even think of? Eidim zomemim. Okay, from there it's a unique halacha just for, right, it's a unique place just for murderers. Rabbi Yochanan omer kal vachomer. Umahu sha'asa ma'aseh b'mezid eino goleh. Someone who murders, there's accidental murder and there's intentional murder. If someone does an act, meaning murders, intentionally, b'mezid, eino goleh, he doesn't get to go to the ir miklat, right? He doesn't go there. Hein shelo asu maaseh b'mezid, eino din shelo yiglu. Now, these people didn't do a maaseh. Now, you can explain this in two ways, right? They didn't do a maaseh because it's just dibur, they just spoke. And they didn't actually kill anybody because they just lied about it, tried to get someone killed, but they didn't actually get them killed. And they did it intentionally, just like the murderer who did it intentionally. But just like the murderer who murders intentionally doesn't go to the ir miklat, then obviously these people who intentionally didn't even do anything shouldn't have to go to the ir miklat. Okay, now this is counterintuitive because why doesn't the murderer go to the ir miklat? Because he's worse, right? It's not like he's exempt from an ir miklat, but that's the way they're looking at it, right? This kal vachomer kind of, and we're going to reject it in a minute for this reason. This kal vachomer kind of says, oh, well, if you murdered intentionally, you don't get punished by ir miklat. So, of course, if you didn't murder and yet you did intentionally, you're not going to have to go, right? Because it's less, because you didn't actually do anything. You're not going to have to go to the ir miklat. Okay, you're not going to get punished that way. But the Gemara rejects this and says, "Vihino tenet." What do you mean? That's the proof is the opposite from what you just said, because now here's where we get to this whole thing about the ir miklat. It's got two or even three elements to it. Number one, it's a punishment. Galut. Okay, galut is a punishment. But if you look at it just strictly from the punishment, then you say, oh, the rotzach b'mizid doesn't get the punishment. Rotzach b'mizid gets a worse punishment, right? And even if, let's say, someone murders intentionally and they don't get punished because there was no warning, let's say, so they don't get the death penalty. They also don't get the punishment of galut, but why not? Because galut is not just a punishment. It's an opportunity for atonement. Besides, it also provides protection from the relatives, okay, which is also a positive thing. And to someone who does an act intentionally of murder, he doesn't deserve to get atonement of the ir miklat. That's why he doesn't go to the ir miklat. He's not deserving of going to an ir miklat. So, hein shelo asu maaseh, but maybe these people who tried to get someone convicted to go to an ir miklat, but didn't succeed, right? They didn't actually do anything. B'mezid, maybe even though they did it intentionally, nami liglu, kecha kapara. Maybe they should be allowed to get the atonement. In other words, you can't use this kal vachomer because the kal vachomer doesn't fit with this with the issue of ir miklat, because the ir miklat is complicated. It's both a punishment, but it's also restorative. So maybe, since this is less severe, maybe you would be allowed to go to the ir miklat. The mezid doesn't go because he's not allowed to go to the ir miklat. He doesn't get the benefits of the ir miklat. But maybe this person, these eidim would. And therefore, that kaf chomer doesn't work. It must be like Rish Lakish. So we go back and we say we prefer Rish Lakish. So in both cases, we did in the Gemara, we tried to find a reason, and we said, how do we know? In both cases, we learned it out from a pasuk. Amar Ula, remez leidim zomemim min Torah minayim. Ula says, where do we have an illusion? Okay, this is an important word. It's not minanimile. What's the source? This is, where do we find some allusion to it? Meaning it's obviously not clearly there. It's some sort of something which we could say connects it to our case. So what are we looking for? A remez that there's eidim zomemim in the Torah. So the Gemara says, remez leidim zomemim? What do you mean? Where do we have an allusion to eidim zomemim in the Torah? Ba'aktiv, it says it explicitly. Vasitem lo kasher zaman. Right? There's psukim that describe when people lie falsely, what happens? They get the punishment kasher zaman, what they tried to do, and it says it explicitly. That's not you're not looking for a remez for something that's explicitly in the Torah. Ella, it must be what Ula was saying is remez leidim zomemim shalokim min Torah minayim. How do we know? Where can we find an allusion to our Mishnah? What's our Mishnah? That when there's exceptions to the rule, the punishment is lashes. That's what we want to know. Because we already proved that there's exceptions to the rule. But how do we know that what they get is lashes then? Maybe they just won't get a punishment at all. So that's what we want to know. Do we have some sort of allusion in the Torah for it? And in fact, we do. Dichti. Now we're going to go to the psukim that describe when does a person get lashes. And I'm going to read you the full psukim, even though it doesn't quote it here. Ki yeriv ben anashim, if there's a fight between two people, v'nikshu al mishpat, and they go to the judges, ushfatum, and they judge them, v'tzdiku et hatzadik v'rshiu et harasha, and the judges determine that the righteous person is righteous and the evil person is evil. V'yayim bin akot harasha, when they go to hit the rasha, which is lashes, v'pilo hashafet v'ikau lefanav keder v'shato b'mispar, and the shafet hits him and gives him according to the right number, and then it says arba'im yakenu lo yosif. You should do 40, no more, which we actually learned to be 39. And that's the whole law about lashes. So now in those psukim that talk about lashes, which is perfect because we're trying to know how they get lashes, we're going to find an allusion. Now, it wasn't very clear that this was talking about an eidim zomemim case that was an exception to the rule, but we're going to try to find an allusion to it. So how do we do this? Well, it says v'tzdiku tzaddik v'rshiu et harasha, and then it says v'yayim bin akot harasha. Now, there's something that doesn't make sense about this. Now, I might have explained in a way that seemed to make a lot of sense, but the Gemara is going to question and say, wait a minute. Mishum v'tzdiku tzaddik v'rshiu et harasha. Now, since the judges determined the righteous person was righteous, the evil person was evil, v'hayayim bin akot harasha, what? They get lashes? First of all, there's lots of cases where people have arguments, and the ruling is not lashes, right? And forgetting about that, all they had to do was say ushfatum, they judge them, and then they hit the rasha. You don't need to tell us that they made the good person good and the bad person bad. That's obvious. So what is that coming to say? And we assumed who's the v'tzdiku? What's the subject? Who's the subject? It's the judges. Now they're going to say, no. Here's a different way of understanding that pasuk. Because those words are totally unnecessary and also don't make sense because that's not the only, right? It's not every time you do that, you're going to get lashes. So, Ella eidim shirshiu et hatzadik. We're going to say, okay, now the pasuk said it's tzdiku et hatzadik. What we're going to say is something happened before that. Witnesses came and lied, and when they lied, they made the tzaddik into the rasha and the rasha into the tzaddik. In other words, they did the reverse. Okay, they hirshiu et hatzadik, and they said the person who's really innocent, they said was guilty. Then who's tzdiku et hatzadik? The second group of witnesses, not the judges. Atu eidim achrine, other witnesses came, v'tzdiku et tzaddik to meikara, and then they reestablished the right person was right and the wrong person was wrong. To meikar shavinu lahane rishayim, right? Because originally, v'shavinu lahane rishayim, and then they turned the bad guy into the bad guy again. Okay, then v'hayayim bin akot harasha, and that's when you get lashes. So let's just read it again. How did the psukim work? People are having a fight and they judge them. False witnesses come and make the wrong person right and the right person wrong. Then come a second group of witnesses and they put everything back the way it's supposed to be. It's tzdiku et tzaddik, or it's shiur et harasha, and they put it all right. And then the eidim zomemim are wrong. Who's the rasha now who gets hit? Not the rasha from the judgment, the rasha who is the eidim zomemim. Okay, so it's a totally different way of understanding that pasuk. It's obviously not the pshat. That's why they say it's just a remez. It's an illusion. The fact that those words are really unnecessary and don't make so much sense teaches us that it's talking about something else. To which the Gemara says, why don't you just say very simply, "V'tepaglemi lo ta'aneh." Lo ta'aneh b're'achayid shaker is basically don't testify falsely. That's a lo taseh. Lo taseh is in general. If there's no specific punishment listed, you get lashes. So you would say like this. Eidim zomemim are supposed to get kasher zamam lasol achiv. But when you can't do that, for the reasons that we saw in these cases, then it would default back to lo ta'aneh, which means, okay, we're going to get to a Mishnah very soon on Daf Dalid, which has a whole machloket. You also get lashes and also get kasher zamam. But we're going with the opinion that you don't get both. But in the case where you don't get one, you should get the other. To which, and that would have been much easier than that convoluted way of learning from Itzdiku et Tzaddik. So they say, no, that's because Mishum dehavi lav she'en bo maaseh, v'chol lav she'en bo maaseh, en lo kin alav. This is a very basic concept we're going to see also in our masechet, especially as we talk about who gets lashes and who doesn't, and also is relating to eidim zomemim. If you don't do an action, and speech is considered not an action, so any lo taseh you get lashes, but not if it's a lav she'en bo maaseh. So if there's no action associated with it, then you're not going to. And speech is not an action, therefore you won't get lashes from lo taneh. Okay, there are those who disagree with this, as we'll see in that Mishnah. But right now we're going to assume you go by the mainstream, which is it's a lav she'en bo maaseh, you don't get lashes, and that's why you can't learn it from there. But in the end, you're going to get lashes because of this other pasuk, which we learned from the Veitzdiku et Tzaddik. Okay, now we're going to get to the last part of our Gemara, which is quoting a Braita that has two more exceptions to the rule for eidim zomemim, two more than our Mishnah had. There's four things said about eidim zomemim. Those are the two that we saw in our Mishnah. Okay, you're not going to become a ben grusha ben chalutza if you testified about someone. You're not going to go to an ir miklat. You don't pay the ransom payment. We're going to talk about this in a minute. We'll get into what this is. And you don't get sold to be a slave, a Jewish slave. Okay, we'll talk about both these in detail, and that's the next section. Then they add a fifth. So these are all four cases where the punishment kasher zamam is not going to be in effect here. Mishum Rabbi Akiva amru af emeshamina piatzma. Now Rabbi Akiva, he's talking about something different, but it's another thing they say about eidim zomemim. That if eidim zomemim let's say, became zomemim in a court and then they ran away, and then they go into another court and they admit, we became eidim zomemim in that court. So they don't have to pay. Okay, let's say they said we owed X amount of money. They don't have to pay the money. Okay, why? We're going to see, because it's a knas, it's a penalty, and there's a principle that when you admit, if you admit in court that you stole money from someone, you have to pay the money. But if it was theft where you have to pay double, you won't have to pay the double, because the double is knas. So you'll replace the money that you stole, but you won't have to pay knas. That's the incentive to get people to admit in court, to confess. So here, if you confess, you don't have to pay at all, because the whole eid zomem is all a knas, which you can already try to figure out why, but we'll get to that later. So let's go through the cases now. So that was the quoting the Braita. Now we're going to go through each case. Okay, we don't need to go into that. We already did. Okay, both those we dealt with already, so we're not going to deal with them here. Okay, what is kofer? If you remember, we learned this in Bava Kama. If your ox is a shor mu'ad, already gored 3 times, and then goes and kills someone. So the shor gets killed, and you're supposed to also get killed because you caused the death of someone, your property. However, since you didn't do it with your own hands, the Torah gives you a way out, okay? Specifically when it comes to murder, if you murder someone, there's no ransom payment. You can't pay your way out. But in the case where your ox or your property killed someone, you can pay your way out. The pasuk says, "Im kofer yushat alav." If we put a kofer on you, meaning if you pay your way out, v'natan pidyon nafsho, you can redeem yourself. Now that, let's say, okay, so now, what if you lied about someone and said that they owe this kofer payment? Their ox killed someone. It wasn't true. And you become an eid zomem, so you don't pay this kofer ransom payment that you tried to get them to pay. Why is that? Well, it must be that whoever wrote this Braita held the kufra kapara. The kofer is to just like the ir miklat is a what's the word, kapara? It's for atonement purposes. This is for atonement purposes. Now, you don't deserve atonement for this because you did something else. It's atonement for the fact that your animal killed someone else. You need to atone for that. But if you're an eid zomem, you didn't actually murder anybody. Nobody got killed. Nobody, right? You didn't do anything. So you don't, that atonement is specific for that crime. You can't just copy that to somewhere else, just like you can't become an accidental murderer by having testified about someone you were an accidental murderer. You don't need that atonement. It's not relevant. So now the Gemara, right? Bahane la b'nei kapara ninu. They're not worthy of that atonement. It's not relevant to them. It's like saying the status of a, right? You're going to become a ben Rusha, ben Chalutza. It's not relevant to you. You're a Yisrael. What's the relevance, right? These are things that just don't fit. So, Mantana kufar kapara. Who's the one who holds this way? Now, the Gemara is under the assumption that not everybody thinks that. Some people think that the ransom payment you're paying is actually paying the value of the person that you killed, and that it's a monetary payment, or at least that's what we think right now. So who's the one who holds this way? Amar of Chisda Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Brokei, and we actually learned this a few times. Detanya, v'natan pidyon nafsho. It says you have to redeem your soul. Demei nizak. How do you redeem your soul? You pay the value of the person you killed. Okay, it goes by, right? People are valued at different things, which is the whole thing in of itself. Usually we go by what your value is on the slave market. Depends on your age. Depends on how fit you are. So it depends on whether you're male or female. So you pay based on the damage you caused to that person. And that would sound like it's mammon, right? It's a monetary payment because you're replacing the value. Obviously, you can't pay the value of a person in money, but you're giving that money in place of the person who died. Rabbi Shmuel ben Asher, or who was killed. Rabbi Shmuel ben Asher, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broko, Omer Demei Mazik. That's what we were looking for. You pay based on your own value. If your ox caused someone to die, you pay based on how much you're valued at. So my la baka miflage, is that not the root of the machloket? The Mar Savar, the first opinion holds kufra mamona. Umar Savar, kufra kapara. That's the machloket. Is it mammon? Are you replacing the value of that person, or are you redeeming your own self? If you're redeeming yourself, well, then it's atonement. But Amar of Papa Lo, dekule ama kufra kapara. No, you misunderstood. Actually, everybody thinks it's kapara, and then this braita would actually be according to everybody. It's just what's the machloket whether you do demei nizak and demei mazik. Everyone agrees it's to redeem your soul, but it's just a matter of how do you redeem your soul? Do you pay the value of the damage you caused, or do you pay the value of who you are? Okay, that's the question. My time I would do Rabbanan. Well, the rabbis say, why do you pay the value of the person you damage? Because Ne'emar Shatalamata, Ne'emar Shatalamala, he learns it from Xerashah. In a different sugya, when the two people are fighting and there's a pregnant woman in the middle, and they accidentally kill they cause the woman to miscarry. They don't kill her; they cause the woman to miscarry. They pay the value of the fetus, and it says there, "Kasher yushat ala bala yishat." The same yushat appears there as the same yushat appears by us, and just like there, b'dinizak, afkan b'dinizak, there you pay the value of the damage caused. Also here you pay the value of the damage caused, but it's still that's just learned from Gzera Shava, but it's still for atonement. Rabbi Yishmael v'natan pidyon nafsho k'tiv. He says, what do you mean? It says you redeem your soul. How do you redeem your soul if not the value of yourself? It's your own soul. V'Rabbanan im pidyon nafsho k'tiv mim kishamina b'dinizak shamina. And as the rabbis say, it's true, you're redeeming your soul, but your redemption of your soul is based on the damage you caused. Okay, and that's the machloka between them. Anyway, everybody holds for atonement, and that's why the zomemim can't get that punishment. Eidim karim ve'eved ivri. Now we're on the fourth one. You can't get sold to be an eved ivri. Now, when do you get to be sold to be an eved ivri? If you testify, if let's take the regular case before we get to zomemim, somebody is supposed to pay money. They robbed someone else, and they're supposed to pay the money back, and they don't have the money, so they get sold to be a Jewish slave. That's how it works. So now, Sever Rav Hamnuna thought to say, but we're going to see that he was wrong. That's if, let's say, eidim zomemim testify about someone that they stole, and the person had money to pay it back. But it turns out the eidim zomemim were lying, and when they go now to get the eidim zomemim to pay, the eidim zomemim don't have the money to pay. Comes this bright to say, in that case, they won't get sold to be an eved ivri, right? To migo de iu lo nizdabem, because the person, again, kasher zaman, the person they were trying to convict would never have become an eved ivri because he had the money to pay. So inunami lo mizdabnu, so they're not going to get it either. Aval hecha delele ledide, afagav deile ledidhu mizdabnu. But if the person, Rav Hamnuna thought to say, if the person they testified against didn't have the money, he was going to be sold into slavery, then even if these witnesses, now we're going to do the reverse case, the witnesses have the money to pay their way out, but since they were trying to get that person sold into slavery, they actually would get sold into slavery in that case. But then the Gemara says, but that doesn't work because these witnesses could come to the court and say, we're not getting sold into slavery. All we tried to say was that guy stole. The fact that he doesn't have the money to pay has no bearing on us because If he had the money, and you want to make us like him, well, if he had the money, he would have paid and not get sold to be a slave. Therefore, Ananami, we have the money, so we're not going to be lomis dabnin. We're not going to lomis dabnina. You're not going to sell us to slavery. Okay, so they reject that. Ella, but still Rav Hamnuna then wanted to say, after they rejected this, okay, either he had or they had. If one of them had money, there's no selling into slavery. But what if neither of them had? Okay? Then they would be able to be sold in slavery because then no one can make any claim, right? If one had, then already one could say, well, he wasn't going to get sold, I shouldn't, or this, right? Or if he had the money, he wouldn't, and I therefore should. But Amarle Rava says, no, you're wrong. Just like we had before of the Ir Miklat, it's only for them. Only the person who doesn't have the money gets sold into slavery. It says, only if you stole money. These guys didn't steal money. They just testified against someone who stole money. But they're never going to go to get sold into slavery. It's a unique halacha just for someone who stole. So there we have our exceptions. Mishum Rabbi Akiva Amru, my time of Rabbi Akiva, Kasava Knasu, Knas Shalem al Piatzmo, and this is what we already said. It's a knas payment. It's a penalty. This whole thing of eidim zomemim, and it's not compensation because it's not compensation. If you confess, you don't have to pay. That ends our daf. I just want to say one thing. Okay, our basic. If we review the daf, we basically have structure. We started with this exception to the rule in the Mishna. We then said, how did we start in the middle of the whole thing? And then they say, oh, it's just a continuation from Sanhedrin. And then they said, what's the source for these two exceptions to the rule? We brought the sources. Then Ula wanted to know where's the remez for these in the Torah. And then we ended with these 4 cases that are exceptions to the rule. And then the 5th about the Knas. But I want to just end with, as Ayelet said in her introduction, the Mishnah really gets to all the topics covered. And the real question is, why are we starting here? Why are we starting in a very strange place? Why don't we start with the 4th, right, with the Daf Daled, the 4th Mishnah, with the basics? And it's the same thing we ask at the Seder. Why at the Seder do we get people to, right? We start with weird places and we try to just get people to ask questions and tell the story through questions and answers. And I think that if you notice this stuff, in already the first half of Makkot, we got to almost all of the basic topics. We covered how are eidim zomemim, they already quoted it, right? That what's the case of eidim zomemim when we say manu ayitem? They quoted, right? They talked about the concept. It's all knas, right? It's a penalty payment. We talked about lav she'ein bo ma'aseh, you don't get lashes for. We talked about harago ein haragin, how it works, that if you killed, you actually don't get killed, and if you didn't kill, then you do. The whole concept of eidim zomemim. And how did we get to it? Through some backhanded way. But it's much more interesting that way because we then, as we raise questions, we answer them and then we learn better that way. It's a little boring sometimes to just start from the beginning. And perhaps, right, and it's something we've seen, by the way, in the beginning of Masechet, that often in the first daf, you already get to the real critical issues of the daf. Like we already brought up even Ir Miklat and all the issues and the complicated issues that it's also punishment. It's also redemptive. It's also, right, already in the first daf, we opened our eyes to how many amazing things are in this masechet. I saw someone ask, someone said, my favorite masechet. They said, why is it your favorite masechet? And it's because there's fascinating issues to discuss here about these concepts, about, eidim zomemim is so strange, right? You're getting punished for something you didn't even do. And Ir Miklat is so fascinating. You're protected by this place, but you're also punished by going there. And it's got all these different, and you also get atonement. So all of this is already in the first page and it's already piqued your interest. And I think that's why they started in a strange place to kind of get you already to learn these things in a bit of a different way, and not just kind of just saying it in a very dry manner. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day. Welcome to Masechet Makkot.